Hi everybody, what a great video this is for you guys. Now we know that fiscal policy is a major hot topic for paper 2 exams this year, but when these questions come up, they're often themed to major events in the UK economy. So what you don't want to do is when you're writing these essays, you just ignore the theme or you ignore the context. That's not the idea. You want to know the context well, bring in some data and some knowledge of that, but also make sure you're picking points that are relevant to the themes, relevant to the context. So when you're revising, knowing the themes is going to be absolutely crucial, and that's exactly what this video is going to do for you. So take everything down and make sure that you're using it in your paper 2 essays. Let's go, shall we? Well, there are two major themes when it comes to UK fiscal policy at the moment. The first one is the enormous expansionary fiscal policy that we used during COVID times. And I'm talking serious, I'm talking remarkable fiscal stimulus that we used in both ways. Massive increases in government spending and huge tax cuts. So let's understand first what the policies were, then we'll see what were the intentions and what were the problems that came. So first, the policies themselves. Well, on the higher government spending side, we saw literally a blank check to the NHS. Not surprising, it was a pandemic after all, but in all ways, building emergency hospitals, recruiting extra doctors, extra nurses, but also spending on COVID testing, the test and trace scheme, spending on vaccines, all COVID-related expenditures were enormously high. So huge government spending on healthcare. We also saw wage subsidies, right? The furlough scheme, it was known as. The government literally paying the wages of the employed and the self-employed, those people that would have lost their jobs if it wasn't for this scheme. That racked up massive amounts of government debt, a huge increase in government spending on here. But also there was more government spending on welfare, universal credit, we call it in the UK. So the amount of welfare, the amount of universal credit that people could claim went up for a period of time, but also it was easier to claim universal credit. So big increases in government spending in 2020 and 2021, the heart of the COVID crisis. But we also saw massive tax cuts, especially for businesses that were hit hardest by the pandemic. So these tax cuts very much were favoring businesses on the business side. We saw VAT cuts. This is for businesses like leisure businesses, tourism businesses, hospitality businesses. Those industries saw VAT cut from 20% all the way down to 5%, again in 2020 and 2021. But also those industries saw business rates taken away. Business rates is a tax based on the value of business property, and this is a tax that really does burden businesses very heavily. That tax was taken away for those 2 years. A big relief, therefore, for those industries that were hit hardest by the pandemic. Well, the reasons why are very much the same reasons that you guys have learned in the classroom. So expansionary fiscal policy to try and stimulate aggregate demand and try and help an economy out of a recession. Bear in mind that the COVID economic crisis was the deepest recession we've had for 300 years. In 2020, the UK economy contracted by 10%. Which is remarkable when you think about it. So yeah, expansionary fiscal policies to boost aggregate demand, to try and increase economic growth, that's short-term economic growth, to reduce cyclical unemployment, to increase inflation or avoid deflation. We know these are all massive problems when you get into a deep recession. So that's very much the intention of these policies. But did they work? Well, if we look at raising inflation, actually the biggest problem during the heart of the COVID crisis was the risk of deflation. We didn't get deflation, so you could argue these policies had a part to play in preventing that horrible side effect. To reduce unemployment, well, unemployment in the UK only peaked at 5.4%, despite having the deepest recession on record for over 300 years. You could argue the wage subsidy schemes, the furlough scheme, had a big part to play in preventing a large spike in unemployment. What about raising growth? Did we see that effect? Well, in 2020, we had a terrible contraction in the economy, 10% contraction. I just said that, but the recovery that we've had from that crisis has been one of the strongest in the world. And again, you could argue maybe these policies have had a part to play in that. So that's all well and good, you might argue, but we are now dealing with horrible, horrible side effects of these policies. In particular, these two. I mean, our budget deficit right now in the UK is horrible at 5.6% of GDP. But go back to the 2020-2021 fiscal year. Bear in mind, a fiscal year in the UK is essentially from April one year through to the end of March the following year. So the 2020-2021 fiscal year essentially was right at the start of the COVID pandemic. up until March of 2021. And in that fiscal year, our budget deficit was 14.5% of GDP. That means our government borrowed £305 billion just in that one fiscal year. Utterly remarkable. Just to give you some context, the fiscal year before, 2019-2020, our budget deficit was only £40 billion. That was how much the government borrowed that year. So in 1 year, that's an 8-fold increase in government borrowing. Just extortionate, really. We've not had borrowing like this since World War II. That's how bad this budget deficit was. And even during our financial crisis years, our worst budget deficit was £100 billion. So yeah, just crazy. And as we've seen, the fiscal year just gone, 2021-2022, our budget deficit is still pretty high, 5.6% of GDP, £100 billion of government borrowing that was. Our national debt peaked at over 100% of GDP. As we're talking now, it's 96% of GDP. So our government finances have been destroyed because of this huge expansionary fiscal policy. And as you guys have learned, right, the burden on future generations because of this is real. In fact, it's going to be you that are going to be paying all of this back. We're already seeing it. Taxes are going up, cuts to certain areas of government spending, the opportunity cost of paying huge debt interest on this government debt. Just this year, the forecast is we're going to be spending 85 to 90 billion pounds just on servicing government debt. Crazy. And that's where we are at the moment. But also, we are seeing all of these huge expansionary fiscal policies translate into higher rates of inflation as well. CPI inflation is 9%. These policies certainly have had a part to play in creating that with a small negative output gap in the UK. So good to know this, but this is not the current theme of fiscal policy in the UK. We are very much on the contractionary side. Let's understand that. Well, we are very much on the contractionary fiscal policy side now to deal with the mountain of government debt and the huge budget deficit we've racked up from the fiscal stimulus we've just seen. And the way the government is doing this, the contractionary fiscal policy they're using, is very much on the tax side with direct tax rises, big ones. Like, for example, national insurance is going up. This is a tax on having a job. It's another income tax. But here with national insurance, it's not just employees that pay it. Employers have to pay national insurance as well, and that's already increased by 1.25%. Corporation tax is going up next year. So by April 2023, corporation tax will be 25%. Right now it's 19%. Another major direct tax rise. And also income tax is going up. It's already gone up, not explicitly, but by stealth. The Chancellor is committed to freezing the income tax bands in our progressive income tax system all the way through to April 2026. Now think, how is that a tax rise? Well, every year people's pay tends to go up, you'd hope at least by inflation. But if the income tax bands in our progressive income tax system are not rising in line with inflation, then as people earn more simply to match inflation, they could be dragged into higher income tax bands and thus are paying higher rates of income tax. So actually the end result is that people who are earning more in line with inflation are not better off. They could actually be worse off paying higher rates of tax. That is called fiscal drag, and this really is fiscal drag on steroids when you think about it. I mean, I've seen forecasts saying that 1.2 million more people are going to be paying the higher rate of income tax because of this policy, 40%. They're going to end up in that bracket. 1.3 million more people will simply start paying income tax at the 20% rate. And I've also seen that by 2025, the UK government are expecting just freezing the income tax bands to bring in £8 billion more income tax revenue. That's how significant this policy is. So massive direct tax rises, but also bear in mind also on the contractionary side, the VAT cuts that we saw before during COVID times have been reversed. The business rates exemptions have now been reversed. And also the universal credit policies, the benefits policies have been reversed as well. So benefits have come down. So a variety of contractionary fiscal policies, but very much targeting the direct tax rises. But why? Why are they doing this? Well, yeah, to bring down these horrible budget deficits we've just seen, to bring down these sky-high national debt figures, basically to bring them down whereby there is now more confidence in the state of government finances. And really the benefit of that is a long-term benefit. If the government is seen as a less risky borrower, it means that when they issue government bonds, the interest rate they can offer on those bonds can now be lower. So it becomes easier, it becomes cheaper for the government to raise finance over time, to borrow money over time more cheaply, more easily, to then fund public services. So very much it's more of a long-term benefit that the government is going for here. But also, the Chancellor has very explicitly come out and said that we need to do this to make sure that there is headspace, to make sure that there is maneuverability, there is room for expansionary fiscal policy for our next crisis. So if the government wanted to use expansionary fiscal policy again in the next shock that we might have, we have the ability to do so. He argues that, look, if budget deficits are really high, national debt is stubbornly high for a long period of time, we can't afford expansionary fiscal policy for the next shock. But also he says that at the moment we are servicing debt by paying too much debt interest. So by bringing down our national debt, bringing down budget deficits, we're not going to be spending as much on debt interest, freeing up government spending for expansionary fiscal policy if we want to use it for the next crisis. So that's another argument the Chancellor is talking about. But what are the major concerns of using these policies right now? The biggest concern is that it could plunge the economy back into a recession. These are contractionary fiscal policies, contractionary demand-side policies at the end of the day. They could shift AD left and take us back into a recession. That would be a double dip recession. There's a real risk of that with lower growth, with higher unemployment. That's the last thing we want. But also, the timing of this can be significantly questioned, right? We're doing this at a time of a huge cost of living crisis. And the policies we're using are fueling that crisis, you could argue. Take national insurance. We said that's a tax that employers have to pay. Firms have to pay that as well. So by raising that, the chances are they're just going to push up prices and worsen this crisis. So a lot of these policies could worsen this. Take the VAT reversals too. Could worsen this cost of living crisis, but it's generally people are already struggling and you're hitting them hard with income tax rises, with national insurance rises. Really at this time? But that's what's happening. That's what's happening. And at the same time, we talked about benefits cuts. National insurance is a regressive tax. There's a big risk of higher income inequality from these policies as well. VAT, we know the reversals there. VAT is a regressive tax, so there's a genuine risk of higher income inequality from these policies too. The government are coming back though and saying, look, especially to counter point number one, the risk of these policies plunging us back into recession, they're saying, well, that shouldn't happen because we're trying to balance our fiscal policy. It's not pure contractionary fiscal policy, they're saying. Yeah, we're raising direct taxes in particular, but we're going to balance this by big increases in government spending. They've committed to spending £600 billion over the next 5 years on all these areas to try and boost actual growth, so AD, short-term growth, but also potential growth. And they're saying that this should offset the negative impacts of this. Is that really going to happen? I'm a little bit skeptical, but that's what they're saying. So good to know that anyway. We'll wait and see whether they're right or not. But that, guys, is fantastic context. That's where we are at the moment. That's going to be the future of fiscal policy for the next few years. And that, guys, is everything you need to know. The two major themes of fiscal policy right now in the UK. Just make sure you've taken all of this down and make sure you talk about this in your fiscal policy essays in paper 2. You're going to read amazing if you do. It's going to push you to the highest possible marks, that's for sure. So thank you so much for watching this power video. We have another one coming, monetary policy. Stay tuned for that. I'll see you in that video.